For years, Asia built some of the largest and most futuristic airports on Earth. Giant terminals covered in glass and steel, massive runways designed for endless expansion, multi-billion-dollar transportation hubs promoted as symbols of the future. Airports like Beijing Daxing International Airport, Incheon International Airport, and Suvarnabhumi Airport were built around one powerful assumption: that passenger traffic across Asia would continue growing almost forever. During the aviation boom years of the 2000s and 2010s, governments across the region poured hundreds of billions of dollars into giant airport expansions, expecting non-stop increases in tourism, business travel, and global connectivity. To outsiders, these mega airports looked like proof that Asia was becoming the center of the global economy. But according to several former airline employees, the reality inside some of these airports today feels very different from what planners originally imagined. Behind the futuristic architecture and glowing terminals, some sections now feel strangely quiet. Entire gates reportedly sit unused for hours. Certain terminal wings operate far below their intended capacity. One former airline worker described walking through parts of a giant Asian airport late at night and feeling like they were inside a future that never fully arrived. After the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, changing travel habits, weaker international demand, and increasing competition between regional hubs quietly disrupted many of the assumptions these airports were built around. And according to some insiders, parts of Asia's giant aviation empire may now feel far emptier than they were ever supposed to be. During the late 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, governments across Asia became obsessed with one idea: building the future of global aviation. Countries throughout the region believed passenger traffic would continue exploding for decades as economies expanded, tourism surged, and millions of people entered the middle class for the first time. Airports became more than transportation centers. They became symbols of national ambition, economic power, and global influence. Governments competed aggressively to build larger, faster, and more technologically advanced airport hubs than their regional rivals. Massive terminals covered in glass and steel began appearing across the continent. One of the most dramatic examples was Beijing Daxing International Airport, which opened in 2019 with futuristic architecture and enormous capacity designed to handle tens of millions of passengers every year. In South Korea, Incheon International Airport expanded aggressively to position itself as one of Asia's leading transit hubs. In Thailand, Suvarnabhumi Airport became a centerpiece of regional tourism growth. Similar expansion projects appeared across Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Vietnam, and the Middle East. Entire airport cities were planned around future passenger growth projections. Governments expected non-stop increases in tourism, international business travel, and global trade for decades ahead. Airlines also expanded aggressively during this period. Budget carriers exploded across Asia, making air travel cheaper and more accessible to millions of new passengers. International tourism surged rapidly. Business travel increased alongside globalization and international investment. For many years, the growth projections appeared realistic. Passenger traffic across Asia rose dramatically year after year. New terminals opened constantly. Airlines ordered huge fleets of aircraft, expecting demand to continue climbing almost endlessly. Airports became physical proof that a country was modern, connected, and economically powerful. But underneath the optimism was a dangerous assumption: that global travel growth would continue almost permanently without major interruption. Many airports were designed around future traffic levels that depended on economic stability, rising middle-class wealth, open borders, and continuously expanding tourism industries. Then reality changed. Economic uncertainty increased. Competition between regional aviation hubs intensified. Airlines became more cautious about expansion. And after the pandemic years of 2020 and 2021, the aviation industry across Asia experienced a shock that completely disrupted many of the assumptions these giant airport projects were built around. According to several former airline employees, Some mega airports never fully recovered the momentum they were originally designed to handle. And in certain places, parts of these futuristic terminals now feel far larger than the actual number of passengers moving through them today. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the aviation industry across Asia experienced one of the most dramatic collapses in modern transportation history. International borders closed almost overnight. Flights were cancelled across entire regions. Passenger traffic disappeared from airports that had once handled tens of millions of travelers every year. Giant terminals designed to feel crowded suddenly became almost silent. According to several former airline employees, the atmosphere inside some of Asia's mega airports during this period felt surreal. Long hallways remained empty for hours. Entire gates sat unused. Luxury shopping areas inside airports lost most of their customers almost immediately. In some airports, sections of terminals were temporarily shut down because there simply were not enough passengers to justify keeping them fully operational. Airports like Beijing Daxing International Airport, which had only recently opened before the pandemic, faced especially difficult conditions. These airports were built around long-term growth projections, expecting non-stop increases in international traffic for decades. Instead, global aviation suddenly froze. Former airline workers described giant terminals operating at only a fraction of their intended capacity. Some airport employees reportedly worried that the industry might take years to recover if it ever fully returned to earlier expectations at all. Even after restrictions eased, recovery across Asia remained uneven. Domestic travel recovered faster in certain countries, but international travel often remained far weaker than before 2020. Another major shift involved business travel. During the pandemic, companies around the world became more comfortable using video calls and remote meetings instead of constantly flying employees across countries. Some analysts believe this permanently reduced part of the premium business travel market that airlines and airports had relied on heavily for years. Another hidden issue involved airline economics. During the aviation boom years, many airlines aggressively expanded routes expecting non-stop future demand. But after the pandemic, airlines became far more cautious about profitability. Some international routes were permanently cancelled. Others returned with reduced frequencies. Several airports that once hoped to become giant global transit hubs never fully regained the level of connecting traffic they originally projected. Former airline workers also claim that some airport expansion plans quietly slowed after the pandemic. While governments continued publicly promoting long-term aviation growth, insiders noticed increasing caution behind the scenes. Certain planned expansions reportedly faced delays, redesigns, or re-evaluation as passenger forecasts became less certain. Another growing problem is competition. Asia now has multiple giant airports competing for the same international transit passengers. Singapore, Seoul, Bangkok, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Dubai, and several Chinese cities but not every airport can become Asia's primary global superhub. According to several former airline employees, the pandemic exposed a difficult reality hidden behind many of Asia's futuristic airport projects. Some of these mega airports were built for levels of international traffic that may take far longer to fully materialize than planners originally imagined. And in some places, parts of those giant terminals still feel unusually quiet years after the global travel shutdown ended. To ordinary travelers, Asia's mega airports can still look incredibly impressive from the outside. Giant glass terminals, futuristic architecture, luxury lounges, and endless duty-free shopping corridors create the image of non-stop international movement. But according to several former airline employees, parts of some major airports feel far quieter than they were ever originally designed to be, especially during non-peak hours. One former worker described walking through sections of a giant Asian airport late at night and feeling like they were inside an oversized future. Entire terminal wings remained mostly empty. Large seating areas sat unused for hours. Some gates rarely handled flights compared to what planners originally expected when the airports were built. According to insiders, this issue became especially noticeable at airports that expanded aggressively during the aviation boom years of the 2000s and 2010s. governments across Asia built giant terminals based on forecasts predicting non-stop growth in tourism, business travel, and international transit traffic for decades into the future. Airports were designed with enormous capacity to avoid overcrowding years ahead of time. But in some places, actual passenger demand never fully caught up with those expectations. Another hidden issue is that airports are extremely expensive to operate, even when passenger traffic slows. Giant terminals require massive amounts of electricity, air conditioning, security systems, transportation networks, cleaning crews, and maintenance staff. Even if fewer passengers pass through the airport than expected, many operational costs remain extremely high. According to some former airline workers, this creates financial pressure behind the scenes, especially for airports that invested billions into giant expansions expecting non-stop growth. Some insiders claim certain terminal sections are now used far less intensively than planners originally imagined. In some airports, gates remain operational, mainly for flexibility during peak travel seasons, while staying relatively quiet during normal periods. Others describe airport lounges, shopping areas, and transit corridors that feel oversized compared to the actual number of travelers moving through them. Another major factor is changing airline strategy after 2020. Before the pandemic, airlines aggressively expanded international routes to compete for transit passengers across Asia. But after global travel collapsed, airlines became much more cautious about profitability. Some routes never returned. Others operate with lower frequency than before. That means certain airports never regained the level of connecting traffic they once expected to dominate. Competition between mega airports has also become extremely intense. Airports in Singapore, South Korea, Thailand, Japan, China, and the Middle East are all competing for the same pool of international transit travelers. Governments promoted these airports as future global hubs, but not every city can dominate international aviation at the same time. According to some insiders, this created what could be called the future hub problem. Too many airports were built around extremely optimistic assumptions about future passenger growth. But when multiple countries build giant transit hubs simultaneously, some airports inevitably struggle to fully utilize the enormous capacities they were designed for. Former airline workers also point to another psychological effect. Giant empty spaces inside futuristic airports can feel strangely unsettling. Airports are supposed to symbolize movement, energy, and global connectivity. When terminals feel too quiet, the atmosphere changes completely. And according to several insiders, some mega airports across Asia now occasionally feel less like booming transportation centers and more like oversized monuments to growth projections that became far more uncertain after the world changed. According to several former airline employees, one of the strangest parts about watching Asia's aviation industry change was how slowly the atmosphere shifted at first. The airports themselves still looked futuristic and impressive. Giant terminals remained brightly lit. Luxury duty-free stores stayed open. Massive digital screens continued flashing flight information across airports like Incheon International Airport and Beijing Daxing International Airport. But behind the scenes, many workers began noticing subtle signs that the industry was no longer operating with the same momentum as before. Some former employees described terminals feeling unusually quiet during hours that were once expected to be crowded. Others noticed fewer long-haul international flights arriving compared to the peak years of the 2010s. Certain gates reportedly remained unused for long stretches of time. In some airports, workers claim entire sections of terminals operated far below their intended capacity, even after travel restrictions ended. For airline employees who experienced Asia's aviation boom years firsthand, the difference felt dramatic. During the expansion era, governments and airlines genuinely believed Asia would dominate the future of global aviation growth for decades. Billions of dollars were invested into giant airport projects. Airlines ordered massive fleets of aircraft expecting non-stop increases in passenger traffic. Entire careers were built around the assumption that international travel demand would continue rising almost permanently. But after the pandemic, years of 2020 and 2021, many workers quietly began questioning whether those growth assumptions were still realistic. Another hidden issue is that airports depend heavily on constant passenger movement to support the businesses operating inside them. Restaurants, airport lounges, duty-free stores, transportation services, and retail shops all rely on high traveler volume. When passenger traffic weakens, financial pressure spreads across the entire airport ecosystem. Several former workers also described a psychological shift inside some mega airports. During the peak years, terminals felt energetic, crowded, and constantly moving. But according to some insiders, parts of certain airports now feel slower, quieter, and less intense than before. The architecture still looks futuristic, the terminals remain enormous and expensive, but the atmosphere underneath them has changed. And for workers who spent years inside Asia's giant aviation hubs, that quieter atmosphere may be one of the clearest signs that the future these airports were built for has not unfolded exactly the way planners once imagined. Today, the biggest question surrounding Asia's giant airport projects is no longer whether air travel will survive. It absolutely will. The real question is whether some mega airports were built around growth expectations that became too optimistic. Airports like Beijing Daxing International Airport, Incheon International Airport, and several other major hubs across Asia still handle millions of passengers every year. Many remain among the most technologically advanced airports in the world. But according to several former airline employees, some terminals and expansion projects may now feel oversized compared to actual long-term demand. One major reason is that the aviation industry changed dramatically after 2020. Business travel patterns shifted. Airlines became far more cautious about expansion and profitability. Competition between airport hubs intensified across Asia and the Middle East. Economic uncertainty increased globally. At the same time, many countries built giant airport projects, simultaneously expecting to dominate future international transit traffic. But not every airport can become Asia's primary global superhub at the same time. Some analysts now believe parts of Asia's airport boom reflected the same optimism seen in many mega-project eras, enormous infrastructure investments built around assumptions of non-stop future growth. That does not mean these airports are failures. Many still play critical roles in tourism, trade, and transportation. But according to some insiders, certain airports may take far longer than expected to fully utilize the massive capacities they were originally designed for. Another hidden issue is financial sustainability. Giant airports require enormous long-term operational spending, maintenance, staffing, security systems, and infrastructure support. If passenger growth remains weaker than earlier forecasts, maintaining these massive facilities becomes increasingly expensive over time. And according to several former airline workers, that may be why some futuristic terminals across Asia now occasionally feel strangely quiet compared to the crowded future they were originally built to serve. Every day, millions of travelers still pass through Asia's giant airports. The terminals remain bright, futuristic, and technologically impressive. From the outside, airports like Beijing Daxing International Airport and Incheon International Airport still look like symbols of the future. But according to several former airline employees, the reality behind some of these mega projects feels far more complicated. Behind the glass walls and massive terminals are airports that were built for a future of non-stop growth, endless international travel, and constantly rising passenger numbers. In some places, that future arrived far more slowly than expected. In others, parts of it may never fully arrive at all. The lights are still on, flights are still operating. But according to insiders, some of these giant hubs now occasionally feel less like booming gateways to the future and more like oversized monuments to growth projections that became far more uncertain after the world changed. And for the workers who spent years inside these airports, that quiet atmosphere may be one of the clearest signs that Asia's aviation boom is entering a very different era than the one planners once imagined.